It's,
Can you hear us, Doug?
it's good to be with all of you.
You may have to turn up the volume here on our end. All
You all-
right.
Can you hear me there?
All right, try it again, Richard.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Good.
Oh,
Hey,
I apologize. This has to be my mistake. I don't know how we messed up.
yeah, well, here we are to witness your first mistake in all these years. So that's great.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I did. Yeah, kept asking me for a passcode that I didn't have. So I was scrambling trying to find that. But good to be with you all. I apologize. I actually have to leave just a bit early today. I've actually got a medical appointment I need to get to and need to get out a tad early. But so I'm going to just jump in and just share a few thoughts with you while I can. And some of you may know my mother passed away since I was with you the last time. Her funeral was this past Sunday, and had discovered she had liver cancer. Was given the worst case scenario was about 3 to 6 months to live, and I'm not sure she made it 2 months. It was very rapid. Strongest woman that I know, but it was a glorious funeral on Sunday. I think over 1,000 people were there. The music, there was our church's orchestra and choir sang, and I'll tell you, it was very, very powerful. But reminded me once again that if I were a betting man, I would have bet everything I had that my mother would outlive my father. Took much better care of herself, much healthier, but James says our life's a vapor, and we're not promised tomorrow. And so again, I think everyone was challenged to make sure we live today well, because we're not promised tomorrow. And so I want to share with you something that just a scripture that God has challenged me for. And I think especially, every time you enter a year, I feel like oftentimes God will give you a scripture and say, for this next year, I really want you to work on this. And I don't know if any of you has a year-long scripture that each year you sort of look for and say, God, it's probably going to take me all year to get this thing worked out in my life. So what's the scripture for this year? But there's a passage that I think you and we all know well. And to be honest with you, sometimes it's dangerous to know a verse too well, because you familiarize yourself with it and you assume because you've known it all your life that you're actually practicing it, that maybe you even memorized it as a child. And so you think, oh yeah, I got that verse covered. I memorized it when I was 12. But you're not actually doing what it says. And this passage is one of those. It's found in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 or verses 16 and following. It says, the 11 disciples traveled to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had directed them. And so basically they're about to have a mountaintop experience. And we all love mountaintop experiences. We all love devotionals that inspire us and church services that are moving. We love to go to conferences that really uplift us. But in God's economy, mountaintop experiences are not final destinations. They're always pit stops. They're always preparation for the work that lies ahead. So if God's giving you a mountaintop experience, it means he's getting you ready for something else. And so Jesus had told us, and by the way, if you've suddenly seen the risen Christ, you're kind of thinking, do I need any more? Is there any more to be had? And yet Jesus had told people, meet me at this mountain. And so they make their way up there to Galilee. And by the way, you think, we assume that Jesus told them this while he was in the Jerusalem area where he had been resurrected. You'd think Jesus could have just said, well, here I'm in Jerusalem and I'm talking to you now. I'll just tell all your friends to come back tonight and I'll talk some more. But and you would think that if Jesus really wanted to convince everybody that he was raised from the dead, he'd do it in Jerusalem, where all the religious leaders were and the political leaders. But instead, he says, go to Galilee, which means go about a 3 days walking journey away. And if you really want to know what I have to say, you'll make that effort. And I'll tell you, discipleship sometimes and walking with Jesus, there are those who never get what God had for them because they never walk to them. They never go to the mountain. They never go to where they need to go. And I want to commend each of you that tunes in every week for this Bible study. There are those that don't make the effort to come or to zoom in, and so they miss it. And Jesus, so often he could just freely give us everything, but sometimes he makes us have to put a bit of investment work into it first. And so he says, go to this mountain, and if you do, you're going to have a fresh encounter with me. And so it says, when they saw him, they worshiped, but some doubted. And you're familiar with this. You would think if you saw a man that you had known and personally, and you knew that he died, and now you're seeing him again, that ought to create a lot of worship. That ought to convince you for sure. And yet, if you ever wonder why some people just struggle in their Christian faith, well, there were people that knew Jesus and they saw him raised from the dead and they still doubted. They still had issues, which comforts me sometimes when I think, for all I've done to try to work with this guy, he's still struggling. And Jesus, it's like, hey, I was raised from the dead. What more can I do to get you to believe and to be convinced? But it says some doubted. And the interesting thing about that is that in a moment, Jesus is going to command everyone there to make disciples. And you would think he would say, okay, those of you who are worshiping, I want you to make disciples. Those of you who are doubting, maybe you can just kind of sit this one out. But he actually tells everybody there, make disciples. And for me, what that means is sometimes we assume that pastors make disciples, strong Christians make disciples, church leaders make disciples. But what this is going to say is that everybody is commanded to make disciples. So if you are listening to me this morning, you have been commanded to make disciples. And I don't know about you, but every time I see something that Jesus has commanded me to do, I kind of want to lean in and pay attention, because if I take an inventory of my life, I don't want to look in vain to find that in my life, I'm not doing something that Jesus commanded. So verse 18 says, Jesus came near. And, some of those phrases you have to stop and say, well, he's raised from the dead. He's already, he's getting ready to speak to them. Why does he draw near? And you get I've done a lot of public speaking, and I could tell you that if you want to get people's attention, just step 1 or 2 steps closer to the audience. Even if you're up on a big platform and there's thousands of people in front of you, it's amazing what happens if you get out from the pulpit and you take a couple of steps forward. And he steps forward, and I think what that means is that's his way of saying, now listen carefully to what I'm about to say to you. Now, if I'm seeing a formerly dead guy who's standing in front of me talking to me, I'm going to guess I'm going to give him my attention, but he leaves nothing to chance. And so he basically is saying, I really want you to pay attention to what I say next, because it's very important. And of course, in the Gospel of Matthew, it's the very last thing that Matthew will record Jesus saying. And typically, if you're going to write a gospel, the last thing you put in there, if you're telling someone's life like Jesus, you're going to end it with something important, something very strong. And so Jesus steps forward, and then he says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and earth. And in an age in which everyone has an opinion and everyone thinks that whatever their opinion is carries just as much weight as anybody else's opinion, I think it's important where Jesus says, I'm not just sharing you my opinion. I'm speaking as someone who has all authority. As my dad always said, God doesn't give suggestions, he issues commands. Whenever Jesus is speaking, it implies a command. And he says, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. That word go, of course, implies that you're not just staying where you are, that you're being active, you're doing something. I know some people, I know some Christians who've been Christians a long time. They're not making disciples of anyone, and they're not going anywhere, but they feel like that they're strong Christians. Folks, if you are actively disobeying something Jesus commanded, you're not as strong of a Christian as perhaps you'd like to think. And it says, make disciples of all nations. My dad used to always say, I remember being with him in a church where he asked everyone, how many of you people believe this? And everybody raised their hand. And then my dad asked, and how many of you have a valid passport? And not everybody raised their hand. And he said, if you believe that you are commanded to make disciples of all nations, I'm assuming that you'd have a valid passport. So if Jesus sends you to go to another country, you'd be ready to go. You wouldn't have to wait. But of course, the command is make disciples. The command is actually not go, it is make disciples. That is the command. That is the imperative. Make disciples. And he commands everybody to do that. And it's interesting. What is a disciple? What is a disciple? Remember when Jesus showed up beside the boats of Andrew and Peter and James and John, he doesn't look them in the eye and say, believe in me. But there's a lot of people today who assume they're a disciple because they believe in Jesus. But that's not what he commanded them to do. Jesus did not look at Andrew and Peter and say, get into a Bible study about me. There's lots of Christians that go to 3 or 4 Bible studies a week that think that they're good disciples. Disciples are people who follow Jesus. Jesus said to those disciples, get out of your boat and follow me. That's what makes you a disciple. And there's a bunch of people that will go to church on Sunday, but they're not willing to follow Jesus. They're not willing to change their lifestyle. And my dad often said, there's a lot of people that see themselves as Christians, but they don't want to get out of their boat. They call themselves a disciple, but they won't get out of their boat and go with Jesus. It's like, Jesus, I'll be a disciple as long as I can just keep doing everything I've always done. But don't disrupt my world. Don't make me do something I don't want to do. I'm perfectly comfortable fishing, so just leave me here and let's just call me a disciple. But here it says, if you're a disciple, then you're going to be someone who follows Jesus. And it says, so make disciples of all nations, baptizing them, so convert them. And then it says, teaching them in verse 20 to observe everything or to do everything I've commanded you. And by the way, if making a disciple, if you are commanded to make disciples, and part of making a disciple is teaching them to do everything Jesus commanded, then it's incumbent upon you to know everything Jesus commanded. If I were to ask you, just take out a sheet of paper and a pen and list all the commands of Jesus, would you be able to do that? You can't teach someone something you don't know yourself. And if you are commanded to teach people to do everything Jesus commanded, then you need to know what those commands are. And then it says, and lo, by the way, what is the last, if you're commanded to teach people to do everything Jesus commanded, what's the last thing he commanded us to do in this gospel? To make disciples. So in other words, the only way for you to teach the people you're discipling to do everything Jesus commanded is for you to teach them how to make disciples themselves. And so you have not fully made someone a disciple until they are now making someone else a disciple. So let me ask you, if you've been commanded to make disciples and they are not a disciple until they are making disciples themselves, how many disciples have you made? How many disciples could you point to and say that God led me to disciple that person, and now they are a full-fledged disciple. They're following Jesus. They're doing everything Jesus commanded, and they are actually making disciples themselves. And then finally, he says, I'm with you always to the end of the age. In the key, that's why some people always said, that's why they don't fly in airplanes, because Jesus said, and lo, I am with you always. But we all like to claim this verse and say, Jesus said he'd always be with me. But notice the context. I mean, he is always with you. But the context here is, as you are going and making disciples, I will always be with you. So what he's saying is, if you really want to experience the presence of God in your life, go make a disciple. And then you'll experience the power of God, because he loves to see people make disciples. And the interesting thing right now is that we look at America and we see all these Americans who claim to be Christians, and yet the moral fiber, the culture of America is getting worse and worse. And we'd say, well, if there's that many Christians in America, why are things so bad? Well, I was talking to my son, Mike, the other day. He's a church planter in Victoria, Canada. And after COVID, he said, Dad, we thought, okay, we can meet again in person. We can get back to church again. And typically, right across North America, about 30%, churches their attendance has dropped about 30% compared to before COVID. They're running, there's 30% of people didn't come back after COVID on average across all of America. And so a lot of church leaders are saying, where did those people go? Why are they not here anymore? Well, what a lot of church leaders are saying is that we realize that what happened is, for years in churches, we focused on making people church attenders. We invited our neighbor to church. We never invited them to become a disciple. We thought if we could just get them to attend a church service, that we were being successful. But Jesus did not command us to make church attenders. He commanded us to make disciples. And I know a lot of pastors that had people attending church on a regular basis, and so we just assumed that they must be strong Christians. But as soon as COVID strikes, as soon as there's any kind of problem going on, they stop coming. They're not committed. They don't follow through in adversity. And what a lot of pastors are concluding is, I made someone a church attender. I made someone a moral person. I did not make them a disciple. Had they been a disciple, they still would be in church. They'd still be following Jesus. But the church growth movement went for maybe 20 years or so. And the church growth movement kept helping churches figure out how to fill up their building. But folks, I'll tell you, if you've got a church half full of self-centered, spiritually lazy people that are unwilling to go with Jesus, you're not necessarily helping the kingdom any by now filling your building with self-centered, lazy people unwilling to go with Jesus. You just have more non-disciples in the building. Jesus would far rather have a handful of dedicated disciples than a room full of lukewarm people that aren't serious about going with Jesus. When Jesus had a handful of committed disciples, he turned the world upside down. But now we've got churches all over America, and we're losing ground every week. And so when I look at this, I want to say, so what does that mean for us? What should we be asking God to do? And I mean, quite frankly, what that means is every one of us ought to be praying and saying, God, at least help me disciple somebody. At least help me to pour my Christian life into someone so that they ultimately begin pouring their Christian life into someone else. My son, Mike, in his church, after he realized what had happened, he actually gathered all of his core members of his church together, and he said, folks, I have not led you like I should have. I was just happy that you showed up for the services, but I was not making you disciples. And so he said, this is what I want. He said, I want all of you to get into a group of 6 people or so. And I want you to start studying the Bible together and growing and being a disciple together. And he said, I don't want you to get in a big group, because when you do that, there'll be a bunch of people that won't participate. They won't be held accountable. He said, I want you to be in a group small enough that nobody can kind of quietly sit out or not participate. He said, I want you all to be in a group where you're held accountable regularly on your walk with Jesus. And so his core members said, okay, well, we'll try and do that. So they came back to him. They started coming back and they said, well, Mike, who's going to be in my group? Who's going to be in my group? And Mike said, well, you figure that out. Like you go invite your neighbors to be in a Bible study with you. Invite people at work. Maybe you can meet during the lunch hour on Wednesdays and study the Bible together. Meet together before breakfast at work and or at a coffee shop on the way to work and study the Bible. And then they came back and they said, well, Mike, what's the curriculum? What's the lesson plan that we're going to use? He said, well, do you have a Bible? Use that. And they're like, well, okay. And then they came back and they said, where are we supposed to meet? Or do you want us to meet? Like, do we meet at a church building or where do we meet? He said, you figure that out. And Mike said to me, he said, Dad, I'm appalled. He said, these are my core members. These are the strongest Christians I've got in my church. And he said, and they don't know how to make a disciple. And yet they've all been commanded to do so. He said, unless I'm holding their hand and telling them what to study, where to study, when to study, who to study with, he said, they don't have any idea how to go out and make a disciple. And so he pushed his folks to do that. And he's already had some amazing stories. A few weeks ago, he baptized, I think, 4 people. And 3 of the people that were baptized, well, all 4 of the people baptized had gotten involved in a Bible study. Some people in their apartment building started a Bible study. And people were coming to this Bible study that had never, they weren't even Christians yet, and they're in a Bible study. And in the Bible study, they become Christians, and they're told, now you got to do whatever Jesus tells you to do. The first thing here it says is you got to be baptized. They said, well, where will we do that? We don't go to a church. And the church people said, well, come to our church. You can be baptized there. And 3 out of the 4 people that were baptized, the first time they'd been in Mike's church was to come and be baptized. And Mike said, normally what happens is we baptize people and then hope that eventually they become a disciple. Mike said they were disciples before they were ever baptized. He said, we're making people disciples. They're studying the Bible even before they're Christians. He said, but we've always just focused on making them church attenders. And they've attended maybe for years and they've never been a disciple. They've never grown. They've never learned. And so what I want to challenge you with, and something that God is convicting me about, because you come to the Bible study you're in this morning, does not mean you're making disciples. It just means you're a Bible study attender. Making a disciple, if you invite someone to come with you to the Bible study, that doesn't necessarily mean you're making a disciple. You're just encouraging them to be a Bible study attender. A disciple is someone who follows Jesus. A disciple is someone who commits themselves to practice whatever Jesus taught. And ultimately, a true disciple is someone who goes out and makes a disciple of someone else. I tell you what, I'm in my office here this morning in Atlanta, and kind of behind me over here in the corner is an alcove. I've got a little table there. And one of the joys of my life is that I have a book club with my all 3 of my kids. They're all in their 30s now. They're all in Christian ministry now. They all have seminary degrees, but we still meet and read books together and discuss them and grow together. And they come into their dad's study and they see all the books their dad is reading. And I want to encourage them to keep on growing, to keep learning, to keep reading. And I want to model for them what that looks like. I want to show them what it looks like to be a disciple, a follower of Jesus, a learner of Jesus, someone who practices everything that Jesus commands. And I'll tell you what, there's a whole lot of young people out there that would love to have someone like you pour your Christian life into them. And not just to tell them what to do, but to show them what to do, to live out, to follow Jesus so vibrantly and victoriously and joyfully yourself that you make them want to follow Jesus the way they see you following him. And I'll tell you what, if you look all around your life and you can't see anybody who's following Jesus because you invested in their life, then I don't want to put you on a guilt trip, but I want to encourage you, get along with Jesus and ask him to show you someone that you could invest your life in. And it may be your kids, it might be your grandkids that you start to meet with and start to teach your grandkids the Bible and what it looks like to follow Jesus. It might be someone at work that you get 2 or 3 other people at work and say, listen, I'm thinking about doing a Bible study in the lunchroom, or I'm going to get a little conference room here in the workplace, and every Tuesday at noon, just bring your lunch and we'll just go through the Bible together. I know one Christian businessman, he had some people come to him and say, I just keep hearing you reference what the Bible says. I have no idea. I've never studied it. Would you be willing to teach me the Bible? And so here in a secular workplace, a publicly traded company, he's meeting once a week. And he had other people come. Finally, 4 days a week, he was meeting with different groups in his business place, off work hours, at lunch or before work started, and having Bible studies. And people were being discipled by him and growing their faith, and then deciding to be baptized and get involved in a church. And it's not just for the pastor to do, it's for all of us to do. And I'm just afraid that too many of us as Christians, we're so busy going to Bible studies, going to church services, that we're so busy as Christians that we sort of neglect to notice that we're not making any disciples. And the command was never for us just to go to church. The command was make disciples. And so I want to be held accountable for that. Maybe one last story to tell you before I've got to run this morning. As my mother was dying over the last 2 months, she got to the point she was at home and very sore, very weak, sitting in her recliner. And one day I brought my daughter Carrie with me over to her house. And my mom didn't have any shoes or socks on. She complained her feet were really sore. And so I said, my mom, when in years past, she had this kind of foot lotion that she was high on. And she kept telling us, every time we'd come by, she wanted us to take our shoes and socks off, and she'd rub our feet with this foot lotion. She was like this miracle drug that would make us feel better and make our feet feel better. It's always felt awkward for me to have my mother rubbing my feet with some lotion, but she would just love on all of her kids and grandkids. And so now my mom is complaining about her feet being sore. And so it dawned on me. I said, well, Mom, where's that foot lotion of yours? Like, I think I need to go and put that lotion on your feet today. So I went to get the lotion. I thought, boy, I tell you what, I owe my mother. She's done this for me so many times. I'm gonna minister to her. But I'll never forget my daughter Carrie. All of a sudden, she piped up, said, "No, Dad, let me do that. Let me do that." I realized my daughter desperately wanted to show her grandmother how much she loved her. And she didn't know what to do. How do you help a dying woman, 83 years old? My daughter's like 31, and she's trying to think, what do I do to help my grandma? And all of a sudden, she grabbed that lotion. I wish I've got a picture of it. I didn't really set up to put this on the screen, but I took a picture of my daughter just lovingly rubbing and lotioning my mother's feet. And my parents have gotten to the point now where they don't need a lot of property anymore. They don't need a lot. Neither of them could drive a car at the end. They didn't need, 10 guest rooms. If they'd had a swimming pool in their backyard, they wouldn't have used it. They didn't need a lot of rooms in their house. They basically needed a bed and a recliner in their living room. But they had invested their lives in people and young people. And I'll tell you what, all 14 of my mother's grandkids traveled back from Canada and everywhere to see her before she died. And my oldest son was the last one to get there, the one that lives in Victoria, Canada, but he got there just hours before my mother died. Her grandchildren adored her because she had invested so much in them. And I thought to myself, some of us might have lots and lots of property and have a big cash portfolio in our retirement funds, but have no young person that wants to rush to our house and rub our feet when we're in rough shape. And my mother in her final days had people fighting over who got to lotion her feet and express love to her. And I thought to myself, and at her funeral, all the pallbearers were her grandsons. And I'll tell you what, they would have done anything for her. But she'd invested in them. She'd invested in them, and they all knew she loved them. And she urged them to follow Jesus. And she showed them what it looked like to follow after Jesus. And all of them do. And I, as I watched that, and I sort of been witnessing that the last few weeks, I thought to myself, is there some young person I can invest myself into and say, I just want to, there's nothing more important in my life than following Jesus, and I want to help teach you how to do the same thing. And one day, hopefully, you'll teach someone else to follow Jesus as well. And when you see that circle complete, where now people you discipled are discipling others, then you know you can check this box and say, I fulfilled this command of Jesus. Now I've made disciples who are making disciples. But don't ever confuse Christian busyness with discipleship making. You're not making disciples until people are now following Jesus and making disciples themselves. And this is a command not just for pastors, it's a command for all of us. So whether it's your grandkids, whether it's people at work, whether it's your next door neighbors, ask God to give you somebody. And if there's nobody in your life right now you're discipling, then ask God to open your spiritual eyes to look around and say, is there someone I can invest? We talk a lot about mentoring, as we get older, who is someone looking for me to mentor them? Jesus didn't actually command us to mentor anybody. He did command us to make disciples. That is a command, and it's for all of us. And so I just want to leave that with you this morning. It's a challenge, but don't think you're too old to be making disciples. Don't think you're too old to be teaching someone and showing someone what it looks like to be an enthusiastic follower of Jesus. And by the way, start by just setting an example. Before you even have anyone to disciple, work on your example. Ask yourself, if someone watched my life, if they just watched me in church, they just watched me in a church, in a worship service, would they look at me and say, now there's someone who's in love with Jesus. There's someone who's following Jesus wherever Jesus tells them to go. Do you even have the kind of model, the way you're living your life, that would inspire young people to say, if that is what it means to be a Jesus follower, then I want to follow him too. Well, I'm sorry, I've got to run a little earlier this morning, but perhaps you guys there in the room can just talk a minute about so how would you disciple someone today, or how are you doing that? Where are you finding would-be disciples? Do you have neighbors that have never been discipled? By the way, I work with these high-level CEOs and like Dave Cavett and others, and a bunch of these guys, very successful business people, they've said, no one ever discipled me. I've never been discipled. I'm a church attender. I try to do what I can, but no one ever walked with me and taught me how to walk with Jesus. And once you become successful in business, then it's kind of embarrassing to admit that you don't know how to be a disciple yourself. You're a church attender. You're a good person. You're someone who believes in Jesus, but no one ever discipled you. So it might even be you just need to first find someone that will disciple you. And going to a Bible study is great, but it doesn't cover all the bases of what it means to be a disciple. It can be part of it, but you want more than that. And I just personally believe, just like Jesus, he invested in 12 disciples. After he left, the entire Roman Empire was turned upside down. And I have a feeling that if today's Christians in America would just get serious about making disciples again, we'd see America turn back to God as well. I know a lot of people, after Billy Graham died, everybody said, oh, we're praying for another Billy Graham. That'd be great. I'll take all the Billy Grahams we can get. But you know what? God's method of reaching a world is not to fill stadiums with big evangelists preaching. His method of reaching the world was discipling people one person at a time. And as you disciple someone who makes disciples, eventually the whole world feels the impact. That's always been God's strategy to reach a world, making disciples who make disciples. And so ask God to give you at least one person that you can disciple. And if every one of you will do that, it won't take long before Scottsdale and that area all start to feel the impact of that. Well, I apologize for having to run on you guys, but I've got an important meeting I've got to get to with the doctor this morning. So maybe someone can just kind of guide, maybe a moment of discussion there among yourselves. But there are ways. Be creative, but find ways to disciple others. And you'll not only will you have a blast doing it, but you'll change the world at the same time. So I'm going to run, and I'll see you next month.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Richard.